So in this second video, I want to go a little bit more into the philosophy of Kundalini Yoga. And towards the end of the video, we'll begin to touch on a little bit more to do with the awakening experiences, which we'll really begin to explore in depth in the third video. Not only how to awaken Kundalini, what it feels like when you're having Kundalini awakening or rising experiences, but how to integrate it into the flow of your life. So a little bit about the philosophy of Kundalini Yoga. As we touched on in the previous videos, we have what's called the chakras. So the idea is we're awakening Kundalini through the lower chakras up through the energy body to eventually awaken through the 1,000-petaled lotus of the crown chakra, the totality of our existence, which really connects us to transcendent energy. And one of the important things to remember about Kundalini is a Kundalini awakening experience is not only, in fact, not really a personal experience at all. It happens when you are so open to transcendent awareness that you then become useful to the flow of transcendent awareness in this life. What I mean by this is when you're willing to serve the greater whole of existence, of humanity, then the Kundalini begins to awaken through you so that you can play out that useful role to be of benefit to others in the world. So it's not just a personal experience, it's an experience that is for others, an experience that is for the benefit of others. That's really what happens through a genuine Kundalini awakening experience. But just touching on the philosophy of Kundalini a little bit more. In Kundalini, you'll often hear about the polarity between Shiva or Shaiva and Shakti. Shiva and Shaiva and Shakti. So one way of looking at this is in terms of Shiva being the symbol for awakened consciousness, and Shakti being the symbol for illuminated or spiritual energy. So the play between consciousness and energy, how we can illuminate consciousness and raise as much energy as we can through the system to then integrate it back into our lives. So Shiva is the being of consciousness. You could say the being of absorption, of stillness as well, of wisdom. And we're awakening Shiva within ourselves, becoming one with that energy so that we can then play out that role as a guide or a teacher or just a conscious being in the world. And we're doing it through wakening up the Shakti. So sometimes you could think of it as the Shiva being the male polarity, the Shakti being the female polarity, and that dance moving through the system, through the awakening of the Kundalini. So the Kundali is the coiled energy, the potency that we begin to build up and connect to through our practice of Kundalini. We then begin to bring it up through the system. And ultimately what we're trying to do through our practice of Kundalini Yoga is we're trying to bring our awareness or the prana, the conscious energy, into what's called the Sushumna central channel, which physiologically is connected to the spine. So often our energy is just going in all sorts of different directions, but when we can finally connect it to the Sushumna channel, we're in contact, as it were, with the depths of our existence. It's like the heartwood of the tree, the core of the tree, as it were, raising it up through the central channel. And we'll talk in a little bit about what begins to happen when consciousness or prana begins to move through the Sushumna central channel. But within the symbolic language of Kundalini, we also have what's known as the Pingala subtle channel, more connected to the right side of the body, and the Ida subtle channel connected to the left side of the body. So there's lots of different associations and symbolism connected to these subtle channels. The Pingala is often connected to the sun and warmth, but the Ida channel is connected to the cold and the moon. The Ida channel comes through the inhalation according to the most ancient text. The Ida channel connects to the inhalation. The cold breath as the breath comes into the body, but then it begins to warm up through the heat of the body, and when it leaves through the exhalation, we have the connection to the warmth and the solar energy, we have the connection to the prana. So when you breathe in, the benefit of the oxygen begins to happen when you exhale, when the oxygen and the prana moves through the system. So it's not that you just raise up the Kundalini through the great inhalation, bringing the energy up. The inhalation actually bringing the energy down through the base of the spine, and then bringing it back up through the exhalation. So it has that sense of grace. One of the dangers with Kundalini is we can approach it in a forceful way, but if we try and wrestle with the serpent energy, well, she's very strong, and we may end up for worse off for having had that sense of the forceful energy. So we need to have a balance within our practice of Kundalini between the energy of relaxation and grace as well as effort. So we're just going in, we're just touching upon these themes in these short YouTube videos. I have a lot of courses on other platforms where we go into the practice and the techniques to awaken Kundalini in more depth. And there's a couple other videos on YouTube that will help you to do that as well. But we're just beginning to sort of touch and play and dance around the surface of some of these themes in this video. So we've talked about the Shiva, or Shaiva, because Kundalini, connected to the Tantric tradition, connected to what's called these days non-dual Shaiva Tantra as well. We're moving from the scattered conceptual mind into that space of oneness or non-duality with existence, where we're just in what is. They just have that sense of suchness. And this can begin to manifest through us, through awakening the Kundalini, which will almost propel us into that state of awakened and liberated consciousness. So just a little bit about the philosophy there of Kundalini. So as we touched on in part 1, working with the lower chakras connected to the unconscious mind, Muladhara chakra, the second chakra, Swadhisthana chakra, having the sense, the practice of the semen retention through Tantra, holding Bindu, which means holding the creative energy within us so that we have energy, as it were, rather than just exploding externally through action, it actually implodes internally. So when you begin to practice Kundalini, and there are other teachers who use the language, people like Robert Bruce, who's well known in the fields of astral projection and out-of-body experiences, as well as Kundalini, uses the word Kundalini shocks, he uses the word Kundalini spikes. I sometimes use the word Kundalini shocks. Because after a while practicing Kundalini, you can have these mini explosions going on, particularly around the head, as the energy begins to force its way through or begins to move through the system. Now, particularly on the liminal space between sleep and wake, these experiences often happen there, in the liminal experiences between sleep and wake, or also within Shavasana. They might happen when you're doing external kriyas or asanas or breath work, but they can also often happen just in the liminal spaces between sleep and wake. That's why there's this wonderful connection between Kundalini and the practice of astral projection and lucid dreaming, and I go into that in some of my other courses. You'll be able to see links to these courses through my website, soulremember.com. So these Kundalini spikes can often begin to emerge in the liminal spaces between sleep and wake. So that's just one of the senses of what these experiences are like. But in the third video of these series, we'll go into now more about what it feels like when you're having Kundalini awakening experiences. Is it any different from just a normal spiritual awakening? We'll begin to explore that in much more depth, and also how to integrate the energy through your system. So just the final few things in this second part, this part 2 of this series of videos on how to be a Kundalini Yogi. Often people associate the practice of Kundalini with what's known as the Shakti Pat, or the initiation, the Shakti Pata. And it can be a bit misleading, because it can give a sense that somehow the Kundalini Shakti needs to be awoken by another human being, another realized human being. But that's not been my experience. And actually, if you go back now, there are current scholars, practitioner scholars working on this, like Christopher Wallace, and he's pointing out that actually in the old Tantric tradition, which was really prevalent in around sort of 350 AD to around the sort of 8th century. The Shaktipat pointed more just to a spiritual awakening, which could be enhanced or confirmed through an initiation from a teacher guru, but it doesn't have to start there. It doesn't have to start there. And maybe this might seem a bit cosmic, but there are all sorts of beings out there in the invisible, subtle realms that can also awaken your consciousness just through a grace. An angel might come through your bedroom and just help to awaken you, or even an alien being, or some sort of awakened nature spirit, or there's all sorts of energies. It doesn't just have to come from the human realm, but it can also just come from you, and you connecting to from your own depth of your being, your soul consciousness, your spirit, with transcendent energy, with the higher self. This is the process that ultimately needs to be there for you to awaken Kundalini. You can't rely upon just having it conferred upon you from an awakened being. It needs to come from yourself. Ultimately, of course, it can be sparked off by others, but ultimately it needs to come from yourself. So that's just a little bit about this term Shaktipat. Kundalini doesn't need to be given to you like some sort of gift from somebody else. It can come internally. Also, it can be awakened from other non-physical beings, not just human beings. And also just you awakening to the universe, the universal energies beginning to flow through you. It can be a very impersonal experience, not just dependent upon going to see any kind of guru teacher. So in the third video, we'll now begin to dive into more about what it feels like to have Kundalini awakening experiences, and then how to integrate the energy through your system so it becomes grounded and whole, and you can express it fully and joyfully in your everyday life.